event is hosted by Miami, Florida, John Monnet Center of Excellence, European and Eurasian Studies Program. I want to thank Dr. Marcus Theo and Christine Kelly for organizing this timely event. Unfortunately, Dr. Theo could not join us this afternoon, so I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel discussion. My name is Julie Tinchen. I'm Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations. First, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest, Dr. Yves Tiberghien, all the way from Vancouver, Canada. He actually arrived just early this morning, and he flew, I think maybe back and forth will take about 15 hours at least. But he traveled all the way just to be with us for a few hours. We really cherish this opportunity to learn from his expertise. So please join me for a round of applause for welcome. And Dr. Yves Tiberghien has a very impressive CV and bio. He's the director and Emeritus of the Institute of Asian Research in the University of British Columbia, Executive Director of the UBC China Council, and Professor of Political Science. In 2014 and 2016, Dr. Tiberghien also served as co-director of the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs, which he founded as chair of the UBC Public Policy Curriculum Committee in 2014. He specializes in East Asian comparative political economy, international political economy, and global economic and environmental governance, with an empirical focus on China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. I also want to highlight that in November 2017, he was made a Knight of National Order of Merit by the French president. That's a very prestigious award. And Dr. Tiberghien is now currently working on a book project titled Artful Graphs, Disruption, Competition, and the Remaking of the Global Economic Order. As you can tell, this is a very impressive long bio, so I will leave you to read. This is also available on the website of the EU Center. And I also want to take the opportunity to introduce two other panelists, our FIU experts. To my left is Dr. Tom Breslin. He's the Professor of Politics and International Relations of FIU. If you haven't got a chance to take his course, please do. He's a wonderful professor. His areas of expertise includes U.S. diplomatic history, history of China's foreign relations, U.S.-China relations, ethnicity, and religion in foreign affairs. And he published a path-breaking book which summarized the path-breaking exploration of the effect of presidential ethnicity on American foreign relations from George Washington to George W. Bush, the Great Anglo-Celtic Divide in the History of American Foreign Relations. And currently he's working on projects on research about the South China Sea, the Chinese frontier during the Great Cultural Revolution, and Americans' disobedient diplomats. And to my right is Dr. Lukas. He's the research associate of Miami, Florida, John Monnet Center of Excellence at FIU. And he's actually a product of our own department. He got his PhD from Politics and International Relations at FIU in 2016. His research interests include Chinese grand strategy, foreign relations between Europe and Asia Pacific, Arctic affairs, as well as security studies and international relations theories more broadly. So you can take a look at the bio from the website. Because of a time constraint, I'm going to start the panel discussion. And we are going to follow the sequence on the flyer. So Dr. Tom Breslin will be the first speaker, and Dr. Lukas will be the second, and Dr. Yves Tiberghien will be the third speaker, and I myself will be the last panelist. And then we are going to open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you. Thank you for attending. I want to draw on two different strands in EU-China relations. One more distant, several years, and one very, very recent, within the past several weeks, in fact, and both of which deal with China's needs and China's tendencies in foreign affairs. Let me start with tendencies first. The EU wants China to play a predictable and reliable role in international relations. And as the United States shared that hope, it also shared the hope that the PRC would open up as a politically as a result of the economic liberalization of its economy. That hope has been disappointed. In fact, over the last several years, China has tightened up domestically in its political structure more than it's loosened. And as a consequence of this, or going along with this, there seems to be a power struggle at the top and immediately below the top for control, and it's going to have a very, very profound impact on China's relations with the EU. The EU and China trade on a very, very vast scale, and it's important for both sides of this to maintain growth in this area. On the Chinese side, failure of growth in exports and in opportunities to make profitable ventures abroad will slow down the growth that the Chinese Communist Party's leaders believe is essential to domestic political stability and to the future of the party. As of this summer, China was the EU's second largest export market, right after the US. And Europe was equally important, or even more so, to China, particularly in light of the Trump program, President Trump's program to raise tariffs on Chinese products. By 2016, China became Germany's most significant trading partner, just to pick one country from the EU, and bilateral trade was running at $180 billion a year. The new normal among German business leaders was to consider that China was more important than any other country in the world to Europe's future economic growth. In fact, by April 2018, Chancellor Angela Merkel had made her 11th trip to China in just 12 years. And Hamburg had become the most important port for China in the EU. 1/3 of the 9 million containers handled by the port of Hamburg were from China. Hamburg had become the headquarters of the China Overseas Shipping Corporation. And Hamburg also was made a point in China's expansive plans to tie Eurasia and the rest of the world together to the Chinese economy, the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. Hamburg was also important to China's internal development of its transportation system. It's one of the headquarters of Airbus, and the Airbus 320 is made there. The key factor here is that China's quickly expanding regional airlines are relying on the Airbus 320. And this is a particular challenge to the US and the Boeing 737 market. In fact, Hamburg had become number 3 after Seattle and Toulouse, Toulouse being another Airbus manufacturing center. So the ties between the EU, focused on Germany, have become very, very important to China's internal regional transportation development for airlines. In the automobile industry, China is the world's most important market by volume. And there, both American and Chinese automobile companies have had a tremendous struggle going back over many years to try and capitalize and make profit in this huge market. Recently, this summer, following up on discussions earlier in the spring, the Chinese government promised BMW, Bavarian Motor Works, that it would allow BMW for the first time ever among foreign companies, automobile companies, to take a majority control in operations in China. The BMW's partner, Brilliance Automobile Group, lost 17% of its stock value in one day once that announcement was made. But there are difficulties in the relationship. For example, one of the things that China needs to maintain its economic growth is to get access to high tech, both in the United States and in Europe. Just this summer, for the first time ever, the German government stepped in to put a ban on China buying high-tech companies, 2 of them. This was made possible by legislation passed in 2017 to veto foreign acquisitions of 25% or more of strategically important companies if the investment put public order or safety at risk. There were disappointments other than that in the China market for foreign investors. And the Trump system of tariff or threats of tariff have complicated them. But while we could focus on individual companies like Fiat Chrysler, which is seeing its profits and projected sales drop by 1/3, I want to talk in a larger sense about the traditional problem that China has had of dealing with multilateral organizations such as the EU. China has, in the past, preferred to deal with individual countries in order to protect its own sense of national sovereignty. And as the 2 German political scientists, Sebastian Heilmann and Dirk Schmidt, wrote some time ago in their book, China's Foreign, Political, and Economic Relations, the EU, I quote, as a supranational institution, remains foreign to prevailing Chinese state-centered thinking, which is geared to preserving national sovereignty. Chinese foreign policy only perceives the EU as a player capable of taking action only when it comes to multilateral trade policy. The Chinese consistently play EU nations off against one another when they try to do business with China. There are frustrations in the relationship on both sides. From the Chinese side, an arms embargo in effect since 1989 and the Tiananmen massacre has been a continuing source of tension. Great Britain, looking to human rights violation in China, basically said no to relaxation of the arms embargo, despite French and German objections. What will happen with Brexit, should Brexit take place, in terms of that arms embargo, which is a key friction point in EU relations, remains to be seen. Interestingly, in the relations between the EU and China. German chief executives, particularly of chemical and automobile industries, have played a major role in Sino-German relations and Sino-EU relations, which is a mirror of a friction point as far as the EU nations have been concerned in relations with China. That is to say, that the Chinese government has pursued its foreign relations, often indirectly through private and semi-private enterprises. But apparently when the objections are raised by the Europeans, they're not conscious of their own method of operation in key areas. Other areas of tension between the EU and China, the People's Republic of China, have been product and trademark policy, piracy, underground factories and trading networks in places like Romania, Hungary, and Italy, manipulated public offerings of Chinese businesses on Western financial markets, counterfeit business documentation, and human trafficking and illegal gambling by Chinese networks. Heilman and Schmidt look at the situation in a somewhat detached manner, but they basically blame Western nations and EU in particular, saying, look, let's not complain about Chinese behavior if we ourselves are not being agile and we're not being as competitive economically as we might be. We need to not just be reactionary in our relations with the West, particularly the US and the EU, or we'll end up like China in the 19th century under the Manchus, always reacting, always behind the competition. We need to be more vigilant and take action in the face of this situation that we're dealing with. Most recently, just this past week, the European Union, Norway, Switzerland, and 21 Asian countries, including China, just this past Friday, pledged to uphold market principles and international standards for infrastructure projects at a summit in Beijing, in Brussels. And this follows on the need for a competitive stance and for a positive relationship between the actors in this situation of opportunity, but tension and frustration. I would like to step back just a little bit and express a worry or two about something that's very significant for every country involved. And that's security, specifically food security, an issue at the very base of Chinese foreign policy. Much of the Belt and Road Initiative is setting in place an infrastructure sufficient to bring to China raw materials and food necessary to keep Chinese well-fed and satisfied with the political order. The king of all foods is protein, and specifically pork. And it's there, basically, that I see some potential trouble coming forward. Not in an unwillingness, for example, by German pork producers or Dutch pork producers or Spanish pork producers to take advantage of a large, super large market in China, where pork is the #1 protein. But on the possibility that just as American farmers in the 19 teens and 1920s overexpanded in order to meet European demands, so too here with American pork products not competitive with European pork products because of US tariffs. That European producers will overexpand their production, drive up the cost of farmland and set in place a trap. Not a deliberate trap, but an economic bubble in land costs, which will lead to major disappointment, particularly in regional areas like Spain, potentially in Italy as well. Though agriculture has a very important role to play in the European political structure. And it's possible that economic pressure from overextended farmers who overextended to take advantage of a growing market for pork in China. And here I might make a footnote that China is the world's largest consumer of pork, with hundreds of millions of pigs raised every year, and billions of pounds of pork consumed. This is such a large issue that might take shape over the next 18 to 24 months, that more than the automobile sector, more than the high-tech sector, I see the potential for great mischief, economic mischief, in the relations in the agricultural sector between Europe, the EU as a whole, and the People's Republic of China. No one will be to blame. It's merely going to arise from conditions, current political conditions. But there's nothing more important than food other than water. And here we're talking about something very, very basic, which is protein. Will Europe overproduce, overcommit to satisfying a very large and very needy market? And I think that more than automobiles, more than electronics, more than high tech, that this will emerge as a very large set of problems, political problems, that will blindside the EU in the near future in its relations with the People's Republic of China. So, thank you.
Next speaker is Dr. Daniel.
Thank you. Let me pull up my slides. I'm not sure if I'm on camera like this, but it's probably better for you to see and follow along with the PowerPoint. I'm going to present some history, some outlook as well on EU-China foreign relations. Also, when looking at it from the point of what's happening with the US and Trump's foreign policy. So I titled it EU-China Foreign Relations, True Love, Shotgun Marriage, or Rebound Relationship, right? And that question will be left for us to answer. In the recent past, a lot was talked about EU-China relations, also here in the China Daily, Chinese news media. They see a lot of potential for a closer relationship between the two. Also in Western media, we see The Economist about 3 weeks ago with the title here, and the Chinese marching into Germany, and here you see Trump leaving the room with the EU officials, Jean-Claude Juncker, Angela Merkel, and the French President Macron, and China and India basically replacing Trump, right? So that's the situation, and we'll see the history and relations of EU-China in that light as well. So going into history, trade relations, and macro relations, the changed international environment since the Trump inauguration, and some EU-Chinese positions, strategies, and then I'll conclude with an outlook. So some historical milestones, just really quick. The 1975 official relations establishment between the two, the EU, and before then it was the EEC. Of course, doesn't exist so very long, and official relations between the Chinese and the West were established in that decade, also with the US. 78, they signed a bilateral trade agreement. 85, a trading cooperation agreement. In 1994, bilateral trade had risen from 2.4 billion in 1980 to 33.9 billion in 1994, and those 14 years with a dip because of the 1989 incident in Beijing. Some establishment of political dialogues. In 1995, EU published a policy document building a comprehensive partnership with China. Some sectoral dialogues have been established by then. In 1998, the creation of the summit meeting system, which continues to this day, annual summits between China and EU, and that was under British EU presidency, Tony Blair. 2003, the launch of a comprehensive strategic partnership to tackle global challenges. Interestingly, that was a year that wasn't so good for EU-US relations either. Iraq, invasion of Iraq, and some Europeans did not follow the US then. Bilateral trade rose between 1994 and 2003, another roughly 70 billion to 100 billion, and China takes the number 2 spot after the US to overtake Switzerland for trade relations. EU policy document was published, Maturing Partnership, Shared Interests and Challenges in EU-China Relations. The PRC published its first EU policy white paper in 2003. In 2006, the EU experiences a rising trade deficit. It was more sort of evened out before. China's export to the EU rose from 19 billion in 1995 to 181 billion in 2006, and China's imports from the EU from 21 billion in 1995, so you see 1995 almost pari, to 90 billion in 2006, so a 90 billion difference there in 2006 already. EC or EU published EU-China, Closer Partners, Growing Responsibilities, and a policy paper on EU-China trade and investment. 2008-2010, global financial crisis or global recession, and then the Eurozone crisis. China emerged then as a financial savior, because of course the crisis started in the US and the US wasn't available for that. Then, 2013, he decided to launch negotiations on a comprehensive investment agreement, and the EU-China 2020 strategic agenda for cooperation was established. 2014, China's policy paper on the EU deepened the China-EU comprehensive strategic partnership as the second white paper since, and last one as well since, the most recent one, if you will. The negotiation launched in 2013, they didn't end up with anything fruitful. In 2016, elements for a new EU strategy on China in a policy paper by the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. You can read some EU sort of goals for that relationship: seizing new opening to strengthen its relationship with China, engage China in its reform process to result in mutual benefits, more or less to make it more like the EU, right? Perhaps more democratic, respectful of human rights. Promoting reciprocity, a level playing field and fair competition, that's the access to the Chinese market. Negotiation of a comprehensive agreement on investment. The Belt and Road Initiative, participation in that from EU side, but with conditionalities attached, as long as it stays sort of according to WTO rules and respecting of human rights. And the UN and G20 responsibilities were reiterated, and human rights in general as well. Maximizing EU cohesion and effectiveness in its dealing with China. That's always a problem that the EU doesn't speak in one voice, right? But rather China also itself tries to sort of break up the EU. Trade relations from the EU side in 2017. You see in imports, China is most important at 20%. Exports, China comes in second after the US with 11%. So China is the EU's second largest trading partner after the US, you could say, according to the European Commission. From the China side, you see in terms of imports, the EU is most important, and exports, the EU comes in second after the US, according to the World Trade Organization. So the EU is China's largest trade partner. Imports, exports, trade balance, sort of in the last decade, you still see that there is a gap here. So the EU or China profits more from the relationship in terms of a surplus than the EU does. So EU imports from China are dominated by industrial and consumer goods, machinery, equipment, footwear, clothing, furniture, lamps, toys. EU exports to China are mainly machinery and equipment, motor vehicles, aircraft, and chemicals. That EU PRC investment agreement that's being negotiated, there were some prior agreements, of course, that are sort of on a lower scale. In 2007, negotiated for a partnership and cooperation agreement without a result. And then since 2013, the launch of negotiations including liberalizations of investment and restriction removal. Summits and dialogues, this EU-China annual summits, of course, that have been established since 1998, and then there's lower level ones as well, at the vice premier level, the ministerial level, director general, and biannual people-to-people dialogue, for example. So looking at the new changed international environment since 2017, are we in a new phase of EU-China foreign relations? Trump, of course, presents a challenge to the status quo of the multilateral global order. And I've separated that into how does the EU side, how is the EU side affected, how is the Chinese side affected. NATO, of course, we all know Trump called it obsolete, and the backing of the US and NATO seems a bit questioned. Climate change, cancelling of the Paris Accords from US side, and the EU holding on to it. Trump has openly supported Brexit and applauded the British for leaving the EU. Of course, the EU doesn't see that well. The G7 summit in Canada, our Canadian friend can probably report about that as well. It was sort of a post-G7 summit incident that Trump launched. And nuclear non-proliferation, Iran, also cancelled by Trump sort of unilaterally. Aluminium and steel tariffs, first the threat thereof, then the actual implementation also affected the EU. On the PRC side, Trump used rhetoric steering up the Korean Peninsula first. Now it seems to be going in a different direction, but that certainly was not welcome, at least at the beginning. Development, climate change, China remains committed to it. Questioning the One China policy, remember that famous phone call to the Taiwanese right when he was elected, basically. Nuclear non-proliferation, Iran, China holds on to Iran, and aluminium steel tariffs, and further tariffs imposed, and the threat of further tariffs as well as the trade surplus, currency manipulation, and Chinese international students in the US rhetoric that Trump has been using and pointing out, some of which with support from Congress, some of which without. EU strategy or behavior towards China. Cooperation in trade, investment and foreign aid. We've seen that trade as sort of a prime focus for the Chinese when it comes to the EU. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the EU pursued, or you should say EU member states pursued a membership, founding membership of the AIB, as opposed to what the US lobbied for not to. Belt and Road Initiative, the US was opposed to that as well, and Europeans more or less embraced it, you could say. Preserving the multilateral global order is another focus for the EU and its China relationship. Also currently goes against the strand of what the US favors. Mutual investment treaty negotiations since 2013. Climate change, another point that also goes against what the US has been advocating for, the Iran deal, nuclear non-proliferation in general. Alternative partner to the US, attention-seeking behavior. So we've seen in 2003, when the US relationship between the EU and US wasn't doing so well, it sought closer relations with China. Now that the US is sort of discontinuing the multilateral global order or climate change or the Iran deal, it's seeking again a closer relationship with China. So this is sort of if you will, a pattern to use China as a potential alternative partner to the US, and therefore an attention-seeking behavior, perhaps to get more out of the US relationship or to relaunch it, to have a renaissance, if you will, right? But it does seem to be a pattern. So all in all, the behavior is driven by the EU's liberal economic and European values, norms, and interests, and the preservation of the multilateral global order. The PRC strategy, on the other hand, towards the EU, it does think of it in balance of power and breaking of US alliances, divide et impera, divide and rule. So if it will weaken the EU-US relationship, it is a good thing to go closer to the EU for China. In 2016, it was, and this goes towards the divide and rule part of it, it was working with Hungary and Greece to prevent an EU condemnation of China's non-acceptance of a tribunal ruling regarding the South China Sea. So the EU in general often doesn't speak with one voice, but in this case, a little bit, 2 more minutes. In this case, it affected the EU non-issue of a condemnation there. Trade, investment, foreign aid, very important. The EIB, Belt and Road Initiative, investment in European companies and loans to Europeans in the midst of the global recession and the Eurozone crisis. Mutual investment treaty negotiations that are ongoing. It has a side door approach in which it signed free trade agreements with Iceland and Switzerland. We're part of the single market, while the EFTA and Norway seems to be coming next year. Climate change and the Iran deal as well, important for EU-China from China's point of view, and filling the US's void in global leadership, as well as status-seeking behavior for China. So the behavior is driven by China's liberal economic world trade interests and balance of power calculations and search for status as well. So to sum up, EU-China relations have moved to a new phase of closer cooperation. The common basis of cooperation is economic interdependence and trade interests, free trade, Belt and Road Initiative, AIB, shared understanding of maintaining the multilateral global order, such as free trade, climate change cooperation, the Iran deal, and there's also some different motivations as we've seen in that. Nevertheless, the relationship does seem to move closer. The sustainability, though, of that partnership will also heavily depend on whether Trump gets re-elected and also on the post-Trump United States. So in terms of answering the question, EU-China, foreign relations, true love, or shotgun marriage, or a rebound relationship, I would say somewhere in between shotgun marriage and rebound relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Banner. So our first speaker is Dr. Tiberghien.
Yes, I didn't prepare a PowerPoint to keep it lively and punchy, but I guess I'll set this as well. Okay, so actually, we're so smooth and organized because my comments really follow well on the first two speakers. It looks like we're just a dream team. So the timing for this panel is wonderful because in case you didn't follow, it was not much in the US news. There was just this huge summit in Brussels just before the weekend. The ASEM summit with 51 countries, 28 Europeans, 23 Asians, and then 2 institutions, ASEAN and EU. And that included India, Russia, Pakistan, China, so lots of big leaders, world leaders. And they came up with a powerful statement. I just wanted to read a couple quotes. One, leaders stressed that recent international developments have boosted the relevance of ASEM as a building block for effective multilateralism and a rules-based international order, anchored in international law and with the UN as its core. They highlighted the vital need of maintaining an open world economy and upholding the rules-based multilateral trading system with the WTO at its core. They stressed the commitments to complying with WTO rules, cooperating on rendering its dispute settlement system more effective, and focusing on WTO reform. They also recognized the serious challenges posed by climate change, its tremendous impact felt worldwide, and the need for urgent and effective action by all countries in line with the Paris Agreement adopted under the UNFCCC. They also noted the findings of the IPCC Special Report, which was last week, which unequivocally confirmed the negative impact of global warming, etc., etc. So when you think of it, it's quite remarkable. You have the leaders of half of the world almost coming up with a very powerful commitment to the WTO, the UN, the climate change agreements, and it's pretty much the world without the US, right? The US would veto any of this, but it shows also the isolation of the US and why China and EU have common interests there. And that includes Russia and India, by the way. So I want to start with 5 key points, and then I'll get to a big trilemma for the EU in dealing with China. First big point, President Trump is pushing Asia and the EU closer. That includes Japan, that includes India, but that also includes China. So China and the EU are getting closer, but they have obstacles. The momentum is going in this direction, but there remains obstacle. Second, it's actually a very fluid time because there's really a bundle between this mutual interest in the liberal international order, things like the UN, the SDGs, the G20, the AIB, WTO, climate change, etc. They're all together, but also confrontation around human rights, security issues, and investments. So, and the BRI used to be an area of support, as noted by a previous speaker, but this year has become an area of suspicion and confrontation to some extent. Third, I wanted to make the point early on that the stakes are really high. We're not just talking of EU-China here. We're talking of one of the fundamental axes for the global system. So, essentially the world is based on US-China relation, US-EU, EU-China, and to some extent what Japan and India do in that equations. Those are the pillars of the entire global system, whether we fall into a 1930s kind of world or whether we continue a post-45 world. So it's one of these critical links in the big story. And currently, the stakes are extremely high. We are at a moment where there is great uncertainty about the future of the global order. And I can give you 3 scenarios of where we could be in 5 years. One, we could have a significant reshaping of global rules and global trade. So the rules will not be as they were for 70 years. Second, we could have a complete collapse of the global trading system and the WTO and be in serious economic crisis. The IMF, World Economic Outlook, just warned about this. So the 1930 scenario is possible. And third, we could even have a military conflict between the US and China over Taiwan or the South China Sea. And that conflict could be unintended, right? Very, very simple to fall into a conflict when 2 ships hit each other, or where, say, a US aircraft carrier went to stop over in Taiwan or something like this. So the survival of the 70 years of prosperity and general peace under the Bretton Woods and UN framework of the post-war are currently in the balance. It's a very unexpected moment, but this is essentially the result of what President Trump has unleashed. So the EU is a key component of that big picture, and in fact, it would not be EU without this system, this global liberal order. What Jean Monnet started in 1950 was completely connected with the UN, with the Bretton Woods system. So that's the third point. The fourth big point is that the EU actually struggles to get a unified approach with China. This is one of the weak points for the EU. And one reason is that the EU, as noted earlier, is very strong on trade. So it's essentially an institution with multiple geographies, variable geometries. On the trade side, it looks like a federal system. Essentially, the EU is federal, functioning as a federal system. So so Donald Trump cannot deal with Germany, has to deal with the EU Commission on trade. But when it comes to foreign policy with big powers, the US, Russia, or China, this is the other side of the spectrum, the weakest area of integration of the EU. That's where intergovernmentalism dominates. And it's very easy to divide the EU. And so we know the story of 2016 with Hungary, the South China Sea condemnation, the condemnation of the UNCLOS ruling. We also know that even France, Germany, and the UK struggled themselves to get a coherent approach within themselves. They're divided already. And finally, my fifth big point is that we did live through historical moments. First in 2008 was the great financial crisis. This is an interesting moment where when the G20 was created, this is a moment where there was a rapprochement, a very serious rapprochement between the EU and China over the management of the global system. And both sides, people like President Sarkozy or the German side, or even Gordon Brown, along with some Chinese, were calling for a new Bretton Woods, for new global financial rules. They thought that the financial crisis had destroyed the existing system. And there was a sort of quiproquo where the EU supported the Chinese claim for a bigger say in the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions, but the Chinese supported the EU request for more financial regulations, against the US. So there was an interesting rapprochement in 2009, especially at the London summit. Second was the AIIB moment in March 2015. There was a big struggle over the creation of that Chinese-led bank for development. The US said, we'll oppose it, this is a bad idea, it will weaken the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, which was Japanese controlled. And the EU went the other way, sided with China. And one after the other, every member from Europe, started with the UK, followed by Germany, France, and everyone else, joined China in creating the AIIB. But in the summer 2018, the Chinese were hoping for another acceleration in standing up to Trump in a very formal way at the last summit, the EU-China summit in July. It didn't happen. And in part is because the EU, while sort of really being on the Chinese side for the global order issues, has very deep concerns about asymmetric economic engagement with China when it comes to foreign investment, Belt and Road Initiative, etc., and security issues. Also, the EU has not suffered enough from Trump yet to really throw its lot with China in a serious way. So the EU is watching the midterm elections first and the auto tariffs. If Trump wins the midterm election and goes forward with 25% tariffs on German cars, then the EU might be ready for something much more serious with China. So essentially, that's where things are in the balance. Okay, so next I want to say something about the battle for the future of the global order, which is the topic of my current book, but also how the EU kind of faces that, right? Because it's so, the US in a way has an alternative, which is America first. For the EU, there's no alternative to the global order. By the way, Canada is in the same boat, right? For us, if the global order, WTO, climate change agreement fall apart, we're in total crisis, right? This is an existential crisis for Canada or for the EU. And by the way, for Japan too. The Prime Minister of Japan is in China this week and is doing exactly the same kind of discussion over WTO, over climate change, So again, Trump has pushed Japan and China to each other. If it goes any further, he will deserve a Nobel Prize for that, bringing reconciliation between Japan and China, which is not easy. So I chair a big think tank alliance called the Vision 20. We did a big summit in Brookings in April, and then we were at the Argentina T20 summit. We found essentially that we're living through a full crisis of globalization. There is both a big backlash against the inequality and domestic disruption, social dislocations in places like in the US. There's also growing systemic risks, the financial system, climate change, etc. And we're living through a huge shift in the balance of power. During the last 20 years alone, more than 20% of global GDP have shifted from established countries, established democracy, the OECD, to emerging economies. Of that, more than half went to China. China was 2% of the world GDP in 1990. Today, it's 16%. China, in 2000, recently, right, was just 10% of US GDP. Today, it's 70%. So, those are tectonic shifts that blow the mind, but challenging the entire system. And so today, as a result of those changes, we're living through a battle for the rules of the world. It's a rule-making competition. It's not just a competition for trade. It's also a period when we risk a zero-sum game of disintegration. So what we take for granted, the post-World War II system of globalization, Bretton Woods, the global liberal order, is in danger. And the irony, of course, is that it's the creator of the order that's threatening the order most directly. That is the US. I can go through others, V20 finding, but I'll skip that. I'll mention that the EU Asia Center Director, part of the EU special, under the EU representative for foreign affairs, Fraser Cameron, came to our university August 28, and he said he called Trump the catalyst for a great EU-Asia rapprochement. Everyone is shocked, both on the EU and Asia side, by the fact that Trump is questioning long-term alliances and the future of the global order. Abe has taken great risk in finishing an EU and Japan FTA and doing all kinds of things, but it has also swung the EU toward China, and Xi, in a way, has unblocked some roadblocks, according to Fraser Cameron. So now the second part of my presentation is about the three great dilemmas, or the great trilemma that the EU faces in dealing with China. So EU stands for multilateralism and the rule-based order, like Canada and Japan, but there's three big issues. The number one is about the US, because the US is also the fundamental partner of the EU on democracy, human rights, security, etc. So the first dilemma is about what is the US really doing and how serious is it? The US is going against the essence of global rules that the EU lives on. WTO, the future of AI technology, the EU is completely dependent on the US, and whatever the US does, there will be fundamental. The Iran deal is a big deal. The attack by John Bolton on the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court, is very painful to the EU. The climate agreement is something very, very high for the EU, very highly supported by public opinion. So it's a big shot. UNESCO, the removal, the US withdrawal from UNESCO. The support of President Trump for Putin, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia after the Khashoggi killing, and other dictators is shocking for the EU. And the attack on NATO, and even on the US-Japan alliance. So this bundle is incredibly shocking for the Europeans. But the EU also noticed there are two voices within Trump administration. On one hand, Trump himself, maybe together with people like Navarro, Lighthizer, and Ross, are anti-global order, anti-Roosevelt and Truman, anti-New Deal, return to sovereignty, and return to 19th century like mercantilism. On the other hand, there is a Pence-Bolton-Pentagon axis, which is really more a battle for rules, using alliances, back to a Cold War, fighting the BRI with a new bill passed in US Congress, using sometimes the norms of human rights and the ideology to fight the sort of rise of China as a power. So there is a very strong realist component there, which is the second voice below the president himself. So for the EU, it's a bit puzzling. How threatening is all this? What's the space for the EU? But there's also a China paradox. I'm writing a series of articles on the Chinese liberal international order paradox. And this is stunning because on the one hand, China has become the globalist, that Davos kind of advocate, that the EU needs as a partner. But there are great caveats, right? They have become a convert to global institutions, global norms. The SDGs of the UN, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Nagoya-Cartagena Protocol on Biodiversity and Biosafety, UNESCO, WTO, etc., etc. October 19, just last week, the EU, China, along with Canada, India, Mexico, Norway, Russia, Switzerland, and Turkey have filed an initial complaint against the US on the steel and aluminum tariffs for violating WTO rules. This is a big deal. But on the other hand, China is doing all kind of, is a frustrating partner when it comes to trade. China relations are always difficult. There is competition over access, over technology, over IP, the same thing that the US has as grievances against China. There is an issue around the South China Sea and the acceptance of UNCLOS. Issues around, ICC. China is not part of the International Criminal Court. So that's, in any case, the first China that the EU looks like is this global partner. The second China is the hardening authoritarian China, and I was mentioning earlier, the illiberal turn at home. The Xinjiang, sort of massive human rights violations, the arrest of lawyers, the Liu Xiaobo issue. And then there is the rising power of China, the third piece of China that's pushing its diplomatic advantage wherever it can. So you have different Chinese faces, right? You have the internationalists, the pro-climate change, but behind them, there is a Chinese PLA, there is Chinese security types. And so China has been very skillful in leveraging its developing country advantage for asymmetric trade and FDI opening, and for buying technology assets in Europe. That has led to a pushback by Europe on the issue of technology purchase, on FDI and market economy, and against infiltration. There is a big document, September 2018, just last month, published on the Belt and Road Initiative, with the EU launching its own Europe-Asia connectivity strategy to kind of push back on the Belt and Road. And then the third part of the trilemma is this US-China vortex. How far will it go? How much room is there for the EU in this? Is it a story of strategic competition with cooperation, or after Pence speech, is it the real start of a Cold War? Is there any space left for Europe? And that creates this great hesitation. It's very puzzling for Europe. If there is no room, if we're dealing with a Cold War, the US will then tighten the noose around the EU and say, you are with us or against us. We're defending you, so how dare you do that with China? If that moment comes, the EU will be in a great bind. And so if it becomes an ideological conflict, with us or wisdom kind of game, battle of rulemaking, etc., if Bolton and Pence get their way, then the EU space will shrink, and that will be a major issue. Canada just experienced this with the Article 3210 in the USMCA, which kind of prevents Canada from having an FTA with China. Final 2 points I'm wrapping up. I wanted to note very interesting results in the opinion poll survey done by the Pew Charitable Institution, the Institute, just published October 1, 2018. When asked, do you see China or the US as the world's leading economic power, Germans say 53% China, 19% US. So a country like Germany sees the future economic growth completely driven by China, not by the US. The UK is divided 40-40. France sees 41 for China, 45 US, also divided. But many other countries like Spain and others see an advantage for China. So Europeans tend to see, since 2008, that China is leading the way. When asked, is China more important than in the past, 80% of Europeans say yes. When asked if the US is more important, only 20% say yes. So they see a shift in global economic gravity toward China, and they want to be part of this. And then there's the issue of President Trump. The level of confidence in President Trump in Europe is, for many countries, below 10%. Spain 7%, France 9%, Germany 10%. Greece a little higher, 17%. And Xi Jinping is beating Donald Trump, therefore. For the UK, 40%, Spain 15%, and for most big countries, Germany, France, 30%. So there is a 3-to-1 advantage for Xi Jinping over Donald Trump in big countries in Europe right now. And that's part of the big story. But then ask, do you prefer the US or China as a fundamental partner in terms of human rights, civil freedom, etc.? Then there is a 65-20 advantage for the US in Europe. So there's a lag, of course. The fundamental values are still lined up, but the Donald Trump issue is a massive shock to the system. So this is the context. At the last week's summit, there were very interesting and astute observations by Prime Minister Lee from Singapore, and he was interviewed in the Straits Times last night, and he was asked about what's happening between Europe and China. And he said, essentially, they're in a big bind. They have lots of business with China, and yet America is crucial to them. It's not just a big economic partner, it's a treaty ally for NATO members. How can they manage both relations and stay friends with both? They don't really want to be forced to go one way or the other, just as we don't want Singaporeans to be forced to choose sides. There are great tensions in the multilateral system, but you can't go back. We're going to have to reform together. In any case, at least Asia and Europe, China and Europe are all on the same side in thinking that the system cannot be let to collapse, has to be saved. So in conclusion, China and the EU have great momentum, bringing them together in cooperation, mostly courtesy of President Trump. But whether they can really go further and get toward a shotgun marriage, I would agree with what you just heard, will depend on actually some positive step by China. So China will have to show some concrete steps on opening to foreign investment or reforming its SOE situation. Also, the EU-China relation depends on forbearance by the US, because the US has the ways of preventing that relationship from gelling if it uses its control over the military and security alliances. Also, the voting base in Europe is very unstable, and so there is fragmentation, and there are parties that start to go pro-Donald Trump, the more extreme right parties, and they're winning votes. The EU-China dance is also ground zero for creative work on a possible surviving global order. And it's happening in parallel to the Japan-China engagement and Japan-EU engagement. So the Japan piece of the story is also interesting. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are many, thank you. There are many different aspects of EU-China relations, but today I'm going to focus on investment. So this is the picture, the cover page of The Economist, the latest issue that Dr. Dana already showed you, but I want to highlight a few things. As you can see, Mona Lisa is just in Maoshu, and she holds a Chinese fan. And the title is quite alarming, China's Designs on Europe. So is that the case? Let's take a look at the numbers first. The figure on the right shows, on the left shows China's total outflow of FDI. From 2009 to 2017, the overall trend is growing. In 2009, the number was a little bit below 50 billion euros. And it jumped to about 180 billion euros in 2016. But because in 2016, the Chinese government enacted capital controls, so the number jumped to about 19 billion euros. And foreign direct investment from China to EU countries followed a similar pattern. In 2009, the FDI from China to EU was a little bit about 3 billion euros, and it jumped to 36 billion euros in 2016, but then it jumped to about 30 billion euros. Then what can we make of this number, and how significant are Chinese investment in EU countries? I think we need to put these numbers into perspective. I'm sorry for this very blurry picture. Maybe you cannot see the number, but overall the message is very clear that the United States and EU are each other's largest source and the destination for foreign direct investment. In 2017, transatlantic FDI flows totaled over $5 trillion US, about 3.2 trillion of US investment in the EU and 2.3 trillion of EU investment in the United States. So in other words, US investment in the EU was about 100 times of the China's investment, foreign direct investment in EU. And the Chinese foreign direct investment inflows to EU only accounts for 2% of total foreign direct investment absorbed by EU. So going back to the cover page of The Economist, China's designs on Europe, that narrative is a bit of an exaggeration. Nonetheless, in the past decade has witnessed China's shopping spree in Europe. China has taken over about 360 companies. Chinese entities also partially or wholly own at least 4 airports, 6 seaports, wind farms in at least 9 countries, and 13 professional soccer teams. As you know, Chinese love soccer, including Chinese President Xi Jinping. Some of the Chinese acquisition in Europe caught media attention. For example, the Hinkley Point nuclear plant in South England is 1/3 owned by China, and the China National Chemical Corporation purchased the Swiss pesticide manufacturer Syngenta for $46.3 billion US, and one Chinese appliance company, Meidi, acquired KUKA, a leading German robotic firm, for $5 billion US in 2016. So Chinese foreign direct investment in EU spread across different member states. But the largest European economies, the UK, Italy, Germany, and France, attracted the largest share of Chinese capital. But traditionally, EU investment in China was much higher than China's investment in EU. But the tide turned rapidly in 2010, and starting in 2014, China's investment in EU overtook or surpassed the flow to the other direction. And in the past 3 years, as the title says, Chinese foreign direct investment flows to the EU were more than 3 times higher than EU FDI in China in 2017. So what happened? Why the past 5 years there was a surge of Chinese foreign direct investment in EU? This actually has a lot to do with China's One Belt, One Road initiative, or BRI, proposed by Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2013. So this is one of the most ambitious undertakings in human history. According to the plan, this BRI project involves the construction of network of railroads and sea land across 65 countries from Asia, the Middle East, Northern Africa, and Europe. So the estimated cost is over $1 trillion US. As you can see that both the Belt and Road that actually started in China and in Europe. So So the surge of the Chinese investment in EU posed as a dilemma for EU leaders. On the one hand, the European Union or EU members needs Chinese investment for job creation and economic growth. This was especially true in the aftermath of the financial crisis or Eurozone debt crisis. Some heavily indebted countries, for example, Greece and Portugal, were on the need for money. And China, as my colleagues has already mentioned before, that is the second largest trading partner for EU. And during a time when Trump is chanting America first and practicing trade protectionism, it's left for the EU to ban a job to preserve the multilateral system. So they also need EU also need China's cooperation to deal with global challenges such as climate change, the terrorism, and the peace on the Korean Peninsula. But for many or some EU member states that were increasingly concerned about the negative impacts of China's investment in EU. First is about technology. Some EU leaders were concerned that the private Chinese investment in EU is an extension of the government's Made in China 2025 strategy. This is a strategy, is a state-led industrial policy, and the aim is to make China the leader of the global high-tech global manufacturing. And for the EU member states, that they were very concerned that by acquiring the high-tech industries in EU, then China could find a shortcut to overtake Western innovation. And in Germany, the attitudes towards China's investment tend to sound the most. This has to do with China's acquisition of KUKA in 2016. But ironically, that China's Made in China 2025 strategy that actually is the result of the Chinese leaders drew inspiration from the German government's Industry 4.0 development plan. And the second big concern is a security risk. Because China has controlled some crucial technology firms and critical infrastructure, those EU lawmakers were concerned about the security implication. And to some of them, they also worried that BRI could create financial and political dependence for participating states. And the third concern, big concern, or maybe more importantly, is a political risk. China's BRI for some EU member states is the source of the much needed investment to them. Some other member states feared that China's security threat, but for others, they could not get enough of the Chinese investment. So the European or EU member states were divided in the attitudes towards China's investments. And for some countries, they were very concerned that China could use Southern and Central European countries as the proxies for Chinese interests. And actually, China has already reaped some political benefits for the investment. For example, my colleagues already mentioned that China successfully exert pressure, or some EU member states like Hungary and Greece blocked the condemnation of China's conduct in South China Sea. And the reactions from EU, I highlighted three different reactions. The first one is tightening investment screening rules. And this has already been implemented by some individual member states. So for example, Germany, Italy already extended the investment screening rules from the energy and infrastructure to some high-tech sectors. And the French government also brought the acquisition of the Toulouse airport by the Chinese consortium. But in addition, they are trying to take a joint European approach. So they're trying to form one investment regime to block the future acquisition by Chinese companies that in the sectors which China does not have reciprocal market access. But this is controversial. This approach is controversial because some member states were concerned that the strict rules on Chinese investment could inflame trade tensions. And business groups worried that these strict rules could be used as a cover for protectionism. And international organizations also warned that it could scare off investors and harm economic growth. The second reaction is, as Dr. Tiberghien mentioned, that the connectivity strategy as an approach to block or compete against China's Belt and Road Initiative, because this is a strategy that trying to link Europe and Asia. There's a lot in common between this strategy and the BRI, but it aims to offer an alternative approach to BRI, alternative source of the infrastructure financing. And the third reaction is the launch of the negotiation for common agreement on investment between the EU and China, and this is still ongoing. As from China, the reactions from China, I highlight a few. And the first one, or a more recent one, is China's progress in removing investment barriers. China, in the past few years, China has already reduced the number of restrictions on foreign investment, the items by 2/3. So early this, just a few months ago, in June 2018, the Chinese government released a negative list for foreign investment effective in July 2018. So for those of you who are not familiar with the negative list, it's a list of industries that prohibits or restricts foreign investment. So any industries not listed on the negative list, then the foreign investors will have an equal treatment with domestic investors. And as you can see that the items on the list was down from 63 in 2017 to 48 in 2018. And it immediately relaxed or removed restrictions on foreign investment in agriculture, mining, and infrastructure sectors. And in the finance, insurance, and automobile sectors will experience more gradual reform. But the Chinese government has already set the timelines that for those for the removal of the investment barriers. So this is quite ironic that on the one hand we see the European countries or EU member states trying to set up the investment barriers against the Chinese investors, but the Chinese government is opening up further by removing investment barriers. And the second item is Made in China 2025. The Chinese government emphasized this is an aspiration that the Chinese government needs to adopt or to commit the state-led industrial policy as a way to improve the national income, the household income, and to compete in a changing global market. Because China is still a developing country, China's annual per capita income is only $80,000, far below that of the developed country. So, for example, in the United States, the annual per capita income is 56,000 US dollars. And the aim of that strategy is to reduce the dependence on foreign technology and to avoid middle-income trap. And what Chinese government also emphasized that what they are doing is to imitate what other successful developed countries have already done. For example, United States use the tariff and government support to nurture the infant industries that at the early stage of the industrialization. So did Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, so all those countries. And as to BRI, the Chinese government emphasized that this initiative actually offered unprecedented opportunities to all countries. And it could reshape global trade and raise a living standard for more than half of the world's population. And by reducing the transportation costs, it could boost EU and China trade. And this strategy provides an open platform to allow countries to seek cooperation for mutual benefits. So this is open, it's not restricted to certain countries. And as Zhang Ming, the ambassador to EU, emphasized that there's good prospects for future EU-China cooperation. According to his estimate, that in the next 15 years, China will import commodities at a value of about 24 trillion US dollars, and China would absorb 2 trillion US dollar foreign direct investment and invest abroad 2 trillion US dollars. So this offers, this brings great opportunities for cooperation between Europe and China. To conclude, that Chinese investment in EU has increased rapidly in the past decade, but China's FDI inflows to EU are relatively small, and the proclamation of China's threat, I think, is overblown. And China has made steady progress in removing investment barriers. So this is quite contrary to the media purchase. And tightening investment screening rules could bring mistrust and undermine EU-China investment environment. EU and China should work together to pursue mutual benefits while resolving disagreements under a rule-based investment regime. Thank you. So now I am putting on my hat of a moderator. The floor is open for discussion, so anyone wants to have any questions.
Yes, I just wanted to see if you could address the issue of China's investment in Africa and how that issue of China's extended influence in Africa, Latin America, is a source of tension or not between the EU and China. Most recently, I think 2 days ago, China reacted very harshly to Secretary of State, the Secretary of State's statement during his trip to Panama, that China was not a friendly, was not a friend of Latin America because of its aggressive investment approaches, and the recent switch of certain Latin American countries to Taiwan, eliminating the relationship with Taiwan to go back to China. So the One China policy, how that issue in terms of China's influence in developing countries is yes or not a source of tension in the EU-China relationship vis-a-vis the African and Latin America. Thank you very much.
I'll just say a couple of things that I intended to actually. First, actually, you pointed out to the recent U.S. approach on Latin America. So there's really a bundle of two different things. One is economic concerns or concerns about impact on development. The other one is geopolitical competition. So in the remark by Vice President Pence, it's heavily a story of geopolitics, right? It's a story of Chinese presence in the Western Hemisphere. So it's sort of Monroe Doctrine 2.0 and 3.0. So Europe doesn't have that part. In fact, they won't play that kind of game, and they stick strictly to the one China policy on Taiwan. So there is not as much, so far we haven't seen that kind of geopolitical concerns. When it comes to Africa or Latin America, I think the EU concern so far is looking at the data, right? And so when we look at all the cases in Africa, when we talk to the African Union and different countries, you find mixed results. So there are many positives, even Djibouti or what's happening in Ethiopia, Tanzania. So there are stories of positive development which have to be recognized, where the population is actually positive on those Chinese investment. There are other areas, or for example in Guinea, which had no electrical grid, and overnight the Chinese built the entire electric grid, right? So those have to be acknowledged as positive, and there is no concerns there. But there are other areas where there have been predatory practices or labor practices that clashed with local conditions. And so the EU concern essentially is there has to be the upholding of common rules of the road, transparency, open competition, following local conditions, and then congruence with climate and SDGs, transparency, etc. So that's what, by the way, what the AIB is doing, which is now jointly managed by Europe, Europeans at the table, is seen as very positive. They do support all the common rules, transparency, etc. So I think it's all about, because China is very diverse. You have this big idea, Belt and Road and all this, launched by the top, and then you have all kind of actors that jump, they all run into the soup, and some of them are predatory or don't follow good rules, right? They're very, very aggressive. But those are private actors typically. And so in a way, the EU and China have a common interest in reining in those overzealous actors that sometimes don't follow the jointly agreed principles.
Any other questions?
So with the Belt and Road Initiative, with plans for railroads expanding from all the way from China into London, doesn't it only seem like a matter of time before, right now, it's kind of a game of tug of war between China and the US over who will have the most trade deals or benefit the most out of the EU trade deals. But with the plans for the Belt and Road Initiative to establish an infrastructure that is integrated within the EU, isn't it only a matter of time where China is really the clear, better choice for the EU through the Belt and Road Initiative?
About 90 to 95% of international commerce is seaborne. Railroads are a tremendous loss leader, an enormous capital investment, and getting a return on that investment is going to be very, very difficult if you're looking at a relatively short time span. A lot of money has been lost. For example, Great Britain on its overseas investments in railroads lost pretty heavily. There was a lot of government support for the U.S. transcontinental systems. I don't think anything has changed. I think also, if you look historically at the so-called Silk Road, which these railroads are supposed to, trans-Eurasian railroads replicate in part, the profit was made in short-term transport. So where the railroads will be, if they are financially stable, they won't be in long-term European to Asian transport, but intra-Asian and intra-European in terms of if you can make improvements that are financially wise and are intensely used enough to generate the profits to pay back, you're all right. You'll be okay. But I think that there's been the reaction to this proposed transcontinental railroad system being exposed and improved and developed to the extent that is projected, those are overblown. And I think that basically people need to take a deep breath. I think we're going to see a lot of money lost, at least in the short term, from that. It's more probable that you can look at maritime transport and see the future of transportation. And even then, you'll find that in recent years, maritime transport has been forced to consolidate mightily to remain profitable, and enormous numbers of ships, particularly large ships, not super large ships, have been scrapped. So the transportation system, the global transportation system is being upgraded. BRI is basically a concept that's overstretched, overfeared, and overreacted to.
That's a good quote.
Next question.
Your presentations were all wonderful and interesting, and I'd like to ask a specific question. As the elections come up in the United States, the midterm elections, and it either becomes a ratification of Trump or an announcement of Trump, how is that affecting the current situation in relationship between Europe and China?
Yeah, there is no question that the whole world is watching those elections, right? It's like the stakes incredibly high, because what it is not just an election about policymaking in the US. The outcome will be either a more constrained Trump presidency or an unleashed Trump presidency. That is, if he ends up winning, still has 30% chance of winning the House and Senate anyway. 85 or 90% chance of retaining Senate majority, right? If he wins both, the expectation will be an unleashed acceleration of the policy on trade, etc. So that would pull the US and China even closer. So that's essentially the EU and China, sorry. Especially if the EU, so there is a bit of a truce that was declared between the EU and the US with the Juncker-Trump agreement in July, but negotiations are not progressing well right now. If it doesn't go very well and the US does put the 25% tariff on cars, then all bets are off, right? Because that's the nuclear bomb essentially in the relationship that will accelerate actions between Europe and China. Now, things also depends what China does, right? Because the EU does need some Chinese moves, so they need them to do something on SOE reforms to accelerate the market reform from the third plenum. So China also has, not everything is just set by what's happening in the US. But if China accelerates its own move, we just heard about the reforms on investment, but it's the first step, it's not seen as enough. And Trump wins the midterm, then there is room for something quite interesting, quite big, right, to happen on EU China.
Dr. Wilkins, that was a tough question. First, recall that if the reference that was made by Dr. Tiberghien, I think, to the strains within the administration itself, I'm not sure if Trump unleashed will survive against a Pentagon or Pence faction. We've seen, so there's all sorts of political mischief that can open up, and a weakening of the U.S. Political base for the Trumpsters. That's one possibility. The other side of this is that I'm not sure that anything that happens will have a profound effect on EU-China relations, and this is why. I think that the Chinese government has made, since 1992, has made its foundational principle economic growth and a national self-sufficiency, which no matter how now it soft pedals this China in 2025, speaks to that basic principle, which is a counterbalance to the national humiliation. Never forget national humiliation. That's been the undergirding, the foundation of the Chinese political order since 1992. And the idea that against this background, China will be able to forge intimate ties with the nations that humiliated it, in the historical consciousness anyway, in the past, is to my mind something of a stretch from a political point of view. Not impossible, but very, very hard, and likely to set off political factionalism or intensify it within China itself. So that's one particular issue. Reinforcing that in my own, that suspicion in my own mind has been the tendency of China's development until pretty recently, and Dr. Zhang basically pointed out the relative smallness of foreign investment, European investment in China, the People's Republic of China, has been the dependence of the People's Republic of China on overseas Chinese and their assets for 70% of its development since the opening of China. There's a comfort level there among Chinese financial specialists and industrialists and so on, with other Chinese, that has made it difficult for them in Africa and in certain parts of Europe to get the benefit that they might otherwise have gotten from their investments. There's been a lot of friction, including in Africa. This is the problem of scale, right? A huge, very successful, surviving cultural group, having to deal with those others of a much smaller scale and much more fragmented. It's always a difficult thing, and we're talking in such big numbers often, at such high stakes, that the interaction becomes very, very complicated and very difficult. So I don't think we should look to a smooth path here. I think there'll be a lot of contingency. And I think an example of this might be Japan. Remember in the late 70s and 80s, when Japan as #1 was going to carry everything forward and began investing in trophy properties, trophy politicians, trophy this, trophy that. And it was huge in Southeast Asia, despite the lingering memories of bad treatment during World War II. And then suddenly Japan became so intensely focused on its own self that it ran out of steam. The investment, the real estate costs and so forth, it skyrocketed to the point in Japan where Japan lost flexibility in dealing with outsiders, and it was a certain degree of arrogance. And I think this sense of victimhood, plus arrogance, plus lack of flexibility, plus local resistance, which we're seeing now in the restrictions of Germany on technology transfer, this could compound. I say could, subjunctive mood, right? Because as a historian, I'm always worried about contingency. So there are a lot of things that are working together here, and I'm not certain we're going to have a clear outcome, either from Trump's election or from any of the possible outcomes of that. Our guest, our visitor, has pointed out at least 3 or more possible routes, but even they are divided among themselves. And I think he's done us a good favor by calling our attention to that.
Okay, and no more questions, or is it time? Okay. Thanks everyone for coming, and we had a great discussion. Again, I want to thank our guests from Canada for coming all over. And thanks to Dr. and Dr. Breslin for joining us and share with us the insightful observations. Thank you.